Okay, so A2 is the next section in Unit 5. A2 deals with environmental factors and physical performance. In your notes, there are two documents in Canvas for you. One of them says student copy. The student copy here is on the left. As you can see, there are blanks. That is what you will fill in. The right side over here is the teacher copy. It is very in-depth, and I'm not actually going to read through everything. I'm going to highlight stuff for you. So it's imperative that you look at both sections together. So to start out with, we look at the body, and we have what's called a peripheral shell, which is the outside, and we have a central core, which is the inside of where the brain and our internal organs are. All right, our core temperature should be kept constant. All right, so when we are cold, you can see our legs might be 31 degrees, our hands might be 28 degrees, but our core is going to stay 37. Whereas when we are hot, that heat expands, or it moves out to the periphery, so our core doesn't get above 37, so it goes to heating the outside up. Right? Which is why in the cold sometimes we shiver or we tighten our muscles up, and then when we are warm we're more relaxed, and we also sweat to help keep this temperature regulated, right? So how does this happen? This happens during cellular respiration, where we need to continually produce heat, and we also have heat loss. So we have heat gain, heat loss going on in the body all the time. All right, it happens during cellular respiration, where we have glucose and fatty acids that are broken down into energy, and chemical bonds are released, and those chemical bonds help to produce ATP. And what is not used as ATP is energy lost as heat throughout the body. Our core temperature is what is determined by our basal metabolic rate. Basal metabolic rate is how much energy do we need or consume or use at rest, right? And it is affected by age, gender, and our hormone levels. All right. So when we look at heat production, let's talk about sedentary conditions. Sedentary conditions are what you're doing right now. You're sitting at a computer, you're listening to me talk, you're doing schoolwork. You're not being very active, like if you were out running on a track or lifting weights or throwing a ball or playing a game or something. All right, so most of our heat is produced by our internal organs while we are sedentary, all right, including the brain. So when we go back and we look at that core temperature here, most of our heat regulation is right here in the center. But once we start getting more active, we then involve the skeletal muscles. So as you can see, exercise intensity increases, the proportion of heat production increases within the skeletal muscle. The larger the muscle is, the more heat production our body has. All right. Also, when we look at different parts of the body, the blood supply. So our blood vessels help to carry nutrients, but it also helps to transfer heat into other parts of the body down what's called the heat transfer gradient, right? Which is what these two charts here tell us about. All right, as I mentioned earlier, it also has hormonal regulations. So as we look here, throughout the day, our core temperature will go down and come back up, typically when we are sleeping, right? So when we get to that 24-hour mark or 0, our temperature is at the lowest, and then it comes back up throughout the day, and then we go back to sleep about 10 o'clock at night, 11 o'clock, and we sleep till about 6 in the morning. Okay, that's where that comes into play, which is why sleep is very important to thermoregulation. Right? As you see here in a menstrual cycle for females, when they ovulate, their temperature is low. So a lot of times women that are trying to get pregnant, they will use their basal metabolic rate or their basal temperature as a predictor to have I ovulated or have I not. And so once ovulation takes place and progesterone, which is a hormone, is used or is needed in the body temperature raises. If they end up becoming pregnant, that body temperature stays elevated. And that's how they know that they are pregnant before they take a pregnancy test. All right. So as you can see here, there is no one true core body temperature, but it is more of a physiological range, which is why up here we said that the physiological range is 36.5 to 37.5 degrees Celsius, which is about 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit. So how does the body thermoregulate in hot and cold environments? Right? So we have what's called a thermoregulatory center. That thermoregulatory center is located here in the hypothalamus of the brain. We receive information by our receptors, so skin receptors, sweat glands, skeletal muscle, visceral temperature, so our temperature receptors in our organs, our temperature receptors in our skin. All right, they send information to the brain. It is processed, it is integrated, and then a necessary change happens to return the body to normal temperature. So let's say we're exercising out in July and it is 98 degrees. Well, what's going to happen is we're going to feel that heat coming into the skin. So that's our effector organ. We're going to feel it. It's going to send from the periphery back to the brain a signal that says, hey, it's hot out here, sweat and cool me down. And our thermoregulatory center is going to activate the sweat glands. Okay? And so that's how this whole process of thermoregulation works, which is why sweating is not a bad thing. Sweating is good and it is a natural thing that happens within the body. All right, so when we detect temperature, temperature is detected within the skin. All right. And then we process in the hypothalamus, and then we have a change in metabolic rate. Thermoregulation allows for the balance of heat production and heat loss, so it's what helps to maintain homeostasis, and it can happen by one of four mechanisms between the body and the environment. The four mechanisms are conduction, convection, radiation, and evaporation. Conduction is where heat transfers between two objects of differing temperatures, where movement goes from one body to the layer of air immediately surrounding the body. So if we're looking at conduction or conduction heat loss in the winter time, we typically wear those thick Under Armour shirts or Nike shirts where we're trying not to lose a lot of heat. And the reason why is because the thickness of the clothing will affect conductive heat loss. Basically what that's doing is it's making a boundary layer around our skin so we don't lose too much heat. Convection is the movement of heat from one place to another by the movement of air or water. So this is where we transfer heat from muscles to the skin surface by the movement of blood. So as blood moves, it moves heat from an area of warm to an area of cold. Right? So with increased air movement, the warm air is replaced by the cool air. Convection, when we look at weather patterns, is what is the wind chill effect, which is why when it is very windy, it is sometimes much colder feeling than if it's not windy, and that's because we're moving the warm air out of the way and bringing cold air in. Radiation is the movement of heat from one place to another without a connective medium. So you have the sun, you have the earth. The sun is very hot. It radiates heat to the earth. The earth warms up, and then we have radiation waves that go out of the earth back into the atmosphere. All right, so radiation is where we have warming of the body by solar energy. And then the last one is evaporation. Evaporation is the change of state of water from the liquid state to the gaseous state. So sweating into water vapor. All right, and this evaporation requires heat energy. The main ways that we have evaporative heat loss in the body is through respiration and through sweating. This is dependent on relative humidity. So when it is 100% humid outside, it typically is in North Carolina, late July, early August, pretty much all of August, early September, where it's very difficult to breathe outside because the air is completely saturated with water vapor, which means it makes it harder for our body to use evaporative cooling when we exercise in the heat of the day, which is why when you look at athletics and when people exercise, a lot of people won't exercise heavily between the hours of 11 and 3 outdoors. And that's because the air is too saturated, the body will heat up too fast, thermoregulation won't happen, and we'll have heat-related illnesses. So as we look at the picture of the skin is adapted to allow for heat loss. And how that happens is the hair shaft moves away from the layer of the skin, all right, so it becomes relaxed. And then we have the sweat gland, and then the sweat comes up into the pore, and then it runs down the top layer of the skin to help with cooling of the tissue. All right, we will actually get into more of the functions of the skin in 7.1, which is an HL section. But for the purposes of this, know that the hair shaft relaxes, sweat comes up through the pores, and then it cools the tissue down. All right, so if we look at our next outcome statement, discuss the significance of humidity and wind in relation to heat loss. High humidity, so 100% humidity, you have a lower heat loss. It's harder for the body to regulate. High humid or low humidity, you have higher heat loss. And the reason for that is you lose heat faster in lower or drier environments. All right. If you have high winds, high wind, it causes a higher heat loss because it's also going to pull the heat out of you. So if we're looking over here to convection, when you have a lot of wind, you lose more heat, which is why when it's really windy, people also wear the long shirts like they do when it's really cold outside for conduction. When you don't have a lot of wind, you don't lose a lot of heat. Okay. So moving into the sweat and sweat response, this is the picture I was explaining a minute ago right here with the skin. The body constricts the vessels to the vital organs and it dilates the vessels to the skin. This is detected through thermoregulation, and what happens here is when these vessels dilate, it opens up the sweat gland to allow sweat to come to the skin and cool us down.